The session will be dedicated to topics of education and how this is changing. And then every participant will address the topic with a short statement, and then we will follow up with some questions, discussion, debates that I will again chair. I will start making a short introduction about IFLA and what we do in relationship to education, and then I will leave the floor to Rosalea, which I guess is more comfortable and knows better the IFLA environment among everyone. Hold on, I share a presentation. Can you see my screen? Confirm? Yes, okay.
Yes.
So this presentation is nothing special. It's just like it gives the state of the art of the affairs with what we are doing with IFLA. It's titled Why and Where IFLA. IFLA, for the people which don't know, was established in 1948. Currently, we have 82 member associations, national member associations, including 7 in Africa and 4 in Middle East. Through 5 regions, we cover the entire world. We have currently with us more than 200,000 landscape architects which are associated through these member associations. And then, because also through this system, through this network, we map education, we have also surveyed during the recent years 555 education programs, tertiary education programs, university programs in landscape architecture across the world, which are producing between 30 and 50,000 graduates per year. These numbers for us are key not only to showcase that IFLA is important, but also to showcase that landscape architecture, landscape architects are a relevant population in the context of contemporary professions. What do we do at IFLA in relationship to global education? We have a system of several people which participate through voluntary efforts, but they undergo a process of elections and voting. And then, so I was elected in my position a few years ago, and under me, we have got 5 other chairs, each for every region, each for the region of IFLA. And they operated the local liaison and independent operations in each region. It means Europe, Africa, Middle East, Asia Pacific, and America. Then we got several working groups, we call them. Their name can change for working group, to panel, to units, to underline subtle differences. But essentially, they do most of the tasks which are related to our control of steering what is the education globally. Of course, what we do is limited by the fact that we are, of course, a supranational organization, which means it does not have a direct regulatory power. We are more pulling strings more than pushing towards a certain direction and giving strict limitation to operation. So what we do is that we operate through the ERA panel, Education Recognition Accreditation panel. We operate recognition accreditation of education programs in the field, and then alongside the management of the current education standards. We have issued regularly update of education standards, and these education standards are adjusted region by region. And region by region, we provide or recognition and or accreditation, with the difference that recognition control a curriculum of a program, and accreditation also the outcome of that curriculum, which means the capability and the skills of the graduates. Why we do this? Because the capability of the skills of graduates are crucial in relationship to entering the profession later on. Then we got another working group, which is called the GEC, Global Education Coordination. And this working group currently is mostly addressing the future education standards. So how we can update, looking to the future, the current education standard. In charge of this working group, there is Rosalea that is with us tonight, and also Ed Wall is one of the members. We are doing this, I would say, a really futuristic approach, so to say, because we are trying to update our standard of reference with a time frame of 2035, really look into the future. And this really connect with the topic of the webinar tonight. Then we got a working group that takes care of the student competition. Student competition is a tool that we use also to pool education, pool the knowledge, pool certain developments in education, but also a chance to provide exchange or a platform for exchange between different approaches. And then we got education activities working group, because beside doing this, we also organize by ourselves education activity that allow the students to connect with students from other regions and then to exchange. In particular, we got one interesting activity which is called Global Studio Program. I invite everyone, which is a student right now, or like a program director, to take a look on our websites in relationship to the Global Studio Program. We don't have time to talk about it now, but it is really important and really provided in the recent years a network between a chance for a network between institutions. Then we got also what we call Future Education Units, which is a novelty, and then it is like a team of people which are trying to create a education program in which we will be able to test what we are developing with the future education standards, essentially. We have our webpage, we have got our Instagram, you can see all the faces, all the people appearing there, you can see me in this program, and on the top line now you see the 5 regional chairs: Maria Bellalta, Amer Bibulla, Cecilie Muraghe, Vincent Wang, and Madara Markova. What is the current situation of global education IFLA? Okay, when we talk about recognition accreditation of programs, currently IFLA offers what? A global recognition system for all the places where there is not like a national association controlling or providing direction to education in the field. Then we have got for 3 regions a accreditation or more deep recognition system, which is for Europe we got one, for Asia Pacific we got another one, Africa also got one, interesting enough. And then we develop a series of equivalence documents, or we are developing right now a series of equivalence documents that allow exchange, interchange, and mobility between the IFLA system and the national system. Among the most interesting ones that we got, we have already undersigned MOU for this equivalence with the South African Council of Architecture Programs. We got the same with some ministries in Taiwan, with Ministry of Education in Taiwan. We are doing right now, developing an equivalent system with the Egyptian Society of Landscape Architecture, which is controlling the profession in Egypt. We are right now developing it with the LAB, the Landscape Architecture Accreditation Board of the United States, which is also crucial because there are about 200 education programs in landscape architecture in the States, and many people globally go to study in the States. And we are also developing compliance in terms of education standard with the government of Saudi Arabia, and we also receive endorsement cooperation agreements with the recognition board of the Philippines. What can you see here? That most of these things are happening right now, and besides us trying to steer the development of landscape architecture education at a transnational level, progressively there are more and more standards, international standards, the objective of which it is not really to control education, but allow a platform for international mobility. So what we are looking is that there is for sure like a progress in the mobility of people studying and then practicing later on landscape architecture. And this is like a very important point to observe, because different from other professions, like for example architecture, landscape architecture is also extremely localized. So our input as IFLA is to provide a platform to this mobility, but in a certain time trying to protect, connect, and then give a framework for the global recognition of regional specificity. So this is what I need to tell to you before to start, and then I leave the floor to Rosalia that can give probably a hint of what she's working on with her working group, but maybe also she will let us know other things. Thank you. Rosalia, do you want to take the floor?
Thank you, Alessandro. I will share. Okay, so thank you very much. I first want to thank you, Flora and Alessandro, for the invitation and privilege to collaborate on this work. I also want to acknowledge the many sort of individuals who've contributed to this work, and in particular, Ed Wall, Kira Klingen, and Nina Marie Lister, who are a part of the working group. So who is the planetary student? This is a synopsis of a white paper and potentially a provocation, really, for this session on the IFLA education standards. So some of you here have been that student, the planetary student, the student whose questions were filed away. You have questioned not just the classroom, but its very agency. I want you to know this talk takes your provocation seriously. And some of you are educators who have done the filing, including me. So let us turn the tables together and take the planetary student perspective, an uncommon experience, but that is precisely the point. Planetary students are in our classrooms right now, working on projects assessed by rubrics written for a world that no longer exists. They absorb debt through their root systems, they carry climate graphs in their arms, they receive satellite signals their bodies cannot process. They stand on stacks of newspapers in dozens of languages, all announcing pressing emergencies. These bodies are in this room right now, or online. They are you, the students, they are our students. The institution, the educators, the students live inside parameters we have built together. Parameters formed by all of us that have become our default setting. Today, I'm interested in what we can see if we push against the default boundaries. I'm going to take a moment to sort of acknowledge maybe why I'm doing this type of work. So, growing up, I watched Australia's coal mining regions transform, periods of boom and bust. Coal mines boomed as prized national assets. The mines were in government hands and among Australia's largest employers. It was privatised in the 1990s. Mass redundancies followed and the community slowly hollowed out. I watched this happen. Then in February 2014, the Southern Hemisphere's biggest open-cut mine caught fire. A pit so vast, Melbourne's entire city could fit inside it. The mine burned for 45 days, over 1,000 hours. The disaster was preventable. The fire was foreseeable. The fire burned and the response was chaotic. Ash rained on people walking through the streets. They struggled to breathe. On the worst days, the air contained nearly 30 times the safe particulate limit. In the following months and years, people died, sooner, younger, and sicker. Health effects compounded in a community already burdened by generations of industry. Everything I was trained to do broke. The design skill set I had drawn on repeatedly couldn't touch the systemic neglect and its deep history. The problem wasn't a design problem in any conventional sense. It was a design problem from an institutional, historical, and political perspective. The pivot required was more than methodological. It was positional. what emerged for me wasn't a new kind of project, but a different understanding of what a designer was, and where designers needed to be. For the past decade, design education has spoken about the planetary student as though they were one person. This ideal graduate, globally conscious, literate, ethical, technically capable. This is the learning outcome made real. What we have less willingly examined is what the student actually experiences internally, the cost of maintaining planetary consciousness within a specific discipline, the kinds of understanding our assessment criteria recognise, what forms of knowledge they ignore. These figures you see here respond to that question of internal experience, not as an aspiration for graduates, but as descriptors of them. These figures are not diagnoses or types to be assigned. Seeing yourself in a figure does not mean you are fixed there. These figures represent disciplinary positions many students move between, often within a single semester, a single day. The planetary student is identified via 12 bodies, each shaped by unique conditions, inheritances, and ways of understanding the plurality of crises. Some bodies are breaking under what they are asked to bear. The resilient turns inspirational stress into fuel. Their feet are tangled in debt. Their heads are like a cracked clock but still keep time. Their self-worth fractures under the multitude of assessment metrics. These students are not failing. They succeed exactly as intended. The toll is high. The professionalised student treats planetary concerns as a portfolio content, learning to perform global consciousness without ever truly internalising it. Some bodies have internalised the planetary as a physical condition. The polycrisis student carries a cascading set of systems failures inside their chest, crises that are now metabolized as anatomy. They do not set these failures aside when they leave the studio. The planetary student is cracking open under the pressure of genuine comprehension. Their torso a globe fracturing at the seams of incompatible scales. The precipitation student is bracing, always bracing, calibrated for rhythms that no longer hold. These students are not overwhelmed by abstraction. They are overwhelmed by expectations of perceived accuracy of the systems and technologies they work with. Some bodies are inactive, contested, specific relation, in particular planetary systems. I want to state that clearly, sometimes disciplines lag behind what you intuitively know. That is the discipline's problem, not yours. As educators, we are working on it. We need to work faster. With a more positive outlook, the rooted planetary student sees depth and breadth as ways to understand the same subject. They choose depth, focusing on one place and learning it thoroughly. They dig deep into the soil and of knowledge. Through this depth comes connections to the planetary, yet disciplines have not often rewarded this approach. Think of this as a vertical epistemology. Knowledge builds up over time in one location, like reading the Earth's story through its stratigraphy, rather than moving across many places. The regenerative student is like a weaver. Imagine their torso as a loom with threads of ecological and technical knowledge interlaced, showing learning is an ongoing process, not a finished state. For them, hope is active, repeated practice, not just a feeling. This practice approach to learning is called the pedagogy of co-creation. There may be regenerative students here, you may be them. To the educator, you may have taught them for years without seeing exactly what they were doing. Their learning outcomes were not written for them. That is where we are here to change together. I want to be clear, I'm not saying the regenerative student is the answer. Redesigning curriculum will not turn the resilient student into a rooted student. It does not work like that. The figures I describe are not a sequence of stages of development. During one day, a student can be simultaneously the polycrisis student, the resilient student, and the self-limiting student. The taxonomy is a map. It asks us to see the figures, not to fix them. It asks us to see the knowledge transferred as framing the worlds we teach, learn, and build as a mirror. These 12 figures constitute collectively a provocation to design education. Every pedagogical framework encodes an image of the student it is designed for. That image is running right now in this room, in all of us. It is our default setting. The question is not whether we have an image, we all have more than one. The question is whether we are aware enough to notice it operating and willing to do the daily work of adjusting it. That is the work not only of curriculum redesign, it is an act of attunement. It is the same act repeated every time a student says something that does not fit. The question is what kind of institution we, educators and students together in the same rooms, are willing to build, because students are not only the people institutions happen to, they are the people who make the institutions what they are, semester by semester, review by review. That is the work. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosalia. Mr. Edwall, maybe you want to continue, you want to add a counter position?
Thank you, Alessandra. Thank you for the invitation to join. Fantastic presentation, Rose. I particularly enjoyed your collages. I have a less I think probably a less structured response, really focusing on three particular areas, maybe three strands that I could pull from or interweave with Rose's presentation. I think I come to today's seminar really with the thought that landscape architecture education is more important than ever. I think, and I think the role of higher education and landscape architects learning is also extremely or increasingly important, particularly as we approach concerns for climate and inequality. I think that we are able to, within the higher educational system and university system, we're able to do things which professional practice can't do so well. But there's also, and we have to recognize there's many things that in universities we don't have the capacity to do. And I think that the recognition of that allows us a particular space within higher education to focus on, maybe focus on what we're good at, focus on what the space of the university affords us. I speak from my own experience. I'm not a professor in education, but I come with an experience both from practice and from almost 20 years of teaching in universities. I'm reminded there's a quote by Steve Jobs where he says, "I'm not dismissing the value of higher education. I'm simply saying that it comes at the expense of experience." And I take issue with that because I think that there is an experience that we gain collectively as students and as educators, which is really key to our becoming landscape architects. I think what I would argue is that there's a critical practice which is extremely important for us to be developing within universities at the early stages of our landscape architecture learning and education, and with three particular dimensions, that of experimentation and rigor, with a particular slowness, which I'll describe. Then that firstly, experimentation is core to what we're able to do in the university. Some processes of invention where we are researching, testing, and discovering, providing a space, a safe space for experimentation for the students, but also for the faculty in their research. I think that this requires importance of taking risks, of getting things wrong, of leaving space open for inquiry, but also open for inclusion by others. The second area, which I think is important in universities, is the rigor that we are able to develop within the space of higher education through testing, providing training, exhaustive training, where we do get exhausted, but training where we can develop an accuracy and a precision in the complex work that landscape architects are required to do. I think the notion of developing a discipline is really key to what we do in universities, but also across the profession. And I don't think we should be afraid of developing a discipline in that work. But developing the rigor requires also filtering out of noise, developing a focus, forming a practice, and a degree of stamina and perseverance. And I think both with experimentation and rigor, we need to do this with a degree of slowness. A way of working where we can take time, where we can listen, where we can be inclusive, and take care of the work that we're doing, but also the people that we're doing it with. I think it provides a time and a space also for iteration. For me, this contrasts much of professional practice, and I think that we are afforded space and time in universities, or we afford ourselves that space. I think it's really important. So within the space, which I believe is still a place of the production of knowledge in higher education, I think that we can create an area that's complementary to practice, even if it tests, it challenges, and at times creates tensions with the practice that we are working with and hopefully informing. But most importantly, I think providing that space to empower young people to transform landscape architecture for themselves, for their careers, and for the world that they are growing up and will be informing, particularly with that emphasis and that concern for the changing climate and the inequity that many of them will experience. Alessandro, on that note, I'll hand it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Richardson, you want to add something from your perspective?
Yes, thank you, Alessandro, and thank you for this invitation to join today. I'm not a landscape architect, as almost everyone in this webinar is. I'm a historian and a critic and have produced a number of books over the years, and I've also taught a lot in universities over the years, though very rarely as a member of a faculty. So I come from this to this from a slightly different perspective. And thinking about this, very interesting, these two presentations we've had so far, I think we're all coming at this from completely different directions in some ways, which is good, I hope. And I certainly am. Thinking about this question, I, I think a lot of landscape architectural education is all about how to be a landscape architect, what to do when, how to do it, qualify, and so on. There's a lot less about how to think about what it means to be a landscape architect and being a landscape architect. And I'm primarily, really, I call myself a historian and critic, so I've always written about landscape history, specialised in the 18th century landscape garden, for example, but also always written about contemporary work as well. And today, I think I've been asked along today to take part because of Geoffrey Jellicoe, who, as you know, was the founder of IFLA back in 1948, and is this wonderful exemplar, I think, of a thinking landscape architect. All his career, he was primarily a working landscape architect. He did an awful lot of teaching, and of course he wrote books, including the Oxford Companion to Gardens, but he was always a working designer. But it's his vision and his ambition as a designer and as a thinker, I think, which might be a useful sidelight and to remind ourselves of him at this point in time, because he never really considered landscape architecture to be a sort of litany of problem-solving attitudes. He did have a modernist background, and perhaps there's a lot of that in modernism, but he was also very much a classicist because he was old enough to be at the Architectural Association in London when the Beaux-Arts style was still de rigueur and modernism hadn't really arrived. This is in the 1920s, basically, the early 20s. But the specific reason, I think, why it's useful thinking about Jellicoe at the moment is because of his amazing book, The Landscape of Man. I'll just put up my my slides for you. Okay. And hopefully you can all see Geoffrey and Susan Jellicoe, who are jointly credited as authors of this extraordinary book, The Landscape of Man. Um, Before just going on to that, I'll just talk about Geoffrey Jellicoe and why he had this visionary attitude. It, it was really because he believed that landscape design in all human culture is informed above all, or beneath it all, really, by subconscious instincts which lie deep within the human psyche across all the world and the globe and all cultures and all history. And this idea came from the psychological theories of Carl Jung, which became a profound and enduring influence on him. And for Jung, there are archetypes or symbolic forms and ideas which are embedded in what he called the collective unconscious of humankind and can be recognized and expressed. And for Jellicoe, these archetypes are most coherently exhibited in landscape design, which he considered, as you probably know, to be the mother of all the arts and the one with the most potential for the future. As Jellicoe put it, quote, "The argument is that the designed landscape has always been a projection of the human psyche into its natural environment." So he was thinking from this extraordinary vaunting perspective. And just a quick reprise of some of his great works. This is the JFK Memorial on the River Thames at Runnymede. This was what he called a great dramatic idea involving a walk across a field and then up through woodland on this stone path of stone sets to that monumentally meditative finale. I think Jellicoe was fairly influenced by Japanese design in this, by the way, and particularly Ryoanji, where anyone who's been there will recall that actually the walk up to the temple complex is very similar to what we can see here. But he also became interested in modern art, and that was another key idea for Jellicoe, the work of Paul Klee, Pablo Picasso, Henry Moore, Ben Nicholson, and so on. For him, the watershed of this, he wasn't that interested in modern art until really the late 1940s, when he lost the competition for Harlow Newtown in England, which was won by his friend and contemporary Sir Frederick Gibbard. And he was very shocked by this, I think, Jellicoe, that he'd lost. But in The Landscape of Man, his book, he did include this image, which is a Paul Klee painting, as you can see, of a village called Mousel in Cornwall, which Jellicoe believed exhibited some of the same sorts of ideas as Gibbard's plan for Harlow Newtown. He says, "The form grew from the complex of agricultural field patterns, but had been rationalized into an art form that might be a landscape designer's interpretation of Mousel in Cornwall." So, whether one goes with that or not, I don't know, but it's certainly a bold and interesting idea. And other works of Jellicoe, which you're probably familiar with, places like Sutton Place in Surrey, where the visitor's really taken on this extraordinary psychodramatic journey through the landscape, ending up with this great sculpture of Ben Nicholson maquette, massively enlarged. But as I say, all of these ideas were coalesced and expressed really in this book, which I've just revised and updated for the publishers Thames and Hudson, and it appeared a couple of days ago. It was published a few days ago. This book was first published in 1975, and I was asked to revise it. I didn't touch the text at all, I have to say. I kept it sacrosanct, and also the slightly archaic title and gendered title, The Landscape of Man. We just kept it all the same because obviously it's a classic work. But I did add a section at the end of the book from around 1990 to the present day, and an introduction and a note on the new edition, and also, most importantly, perhaps updated all the old black and white photos with colour ones. So I'm really hoping that this new iteration of this great work will introduce Jellicoe to a new generation of students. The book has never been out of print, and as many of you know, it's on lots of reading lists still, and I hope it stays there, because it really is, there's no other book like this in all design history, I believe, in any design discipline or artistic discipline, covering every single epoch, every civilization of humankind. It's sort of unsurpassable in terms of its scope and scale, and that comes from Jellicoe's Jungian ideas. It's also unusual, as well as this scope, in that Jellicoe includes a lot of plans in the book and lots of pictures. It's an unfashionable book in terms of its design because it has a lot of pictures. Some of them are not that big either, and also covers a lot of subjects and places which people don't know. It starts with an image of the globe, which we're thinking about at the moment with this Artemis moon shot going on at the moment, during which all of the astronauts and everyone to do with NASA just repeats endless platitudes about how insignificant humankind looks from this distance. But people like Jellicoe, I wish he'd been in the rocket really, so he could have come up with some of his reflections on the Earth, which he talks about. I won't quote now in the book. And then he goes through. I mean, this is for him his landscape history. Carnac in France. He says of this quote, "The stones are regimented, probably for ritual, but each stone is individual with an overwhelming personality." I love that overwhelming personality. This is not so. Jellicoe was not an academic. He didn't study at a university, but at the Architectural Association. In fact, I don't think it would have been possible for somebody who had studied at a major university to have written the book, this freewheeling book, in the way that Jellicoe did. Of this, the Uffington White Horse on the Berkshire Downs in England, 100 AD, he describes it as the first engraving on any landscape of a major work of art. He continues, "The white horse, difficult to see from the ground, was almost certainly made for the gods." How does he know? But this is Jellicoe's confidence, wonderful, overweening confidence, if you like. And then he goes through all landscape cultures, all human culture, and the landscape evocations that result from it. Obviously, here we are in Persia in the late 16th century, where he says the single Chinar, or the Oriental plain in the background there on the right, he says symbolizes a whole grove whose shade brought relief from the burning sun. And he makes the point that the ground plan of Isfahan is really a series of gardens. This is one of Jellicoe's own plans. So he painstakingly drew these plans to show the way that Isfahan was a garden city. And then images such as this of individual structures. So it's quite architectural in many ways, but as we all know, architecture and landscape, the object in the landscape and the landscape itself are always closely related. And then places like the Alhambra. So he has different attitudes and perspectives. Here he talks about the mountain range, the Sierra Nevada, which is the source of its water supply. Its encompassing towers and walls, the supreme example of Moorish imagination and elegance in the design of enclosed landscape. And he includes pictures with views out of the Alhambra into the surrounding city. These slightly different perspectives, certainly not what you get. And I think the main example of this is the Taj Mahal. So, we have the river terrace of the Taj Mahal here looking down towards the Red Fort in the distance. I had to change, these are all black and white photos, and I had great difficulty finding this image and other ones from the perspective of Geoffrey and Susan Jellicoe. Susan was a photographer, by the way. But here he shows that this was the image, he said, and he talks about the black marble tomb in front of it, and then the view back as well. Again, this is extremely difficult to find. So again, seeing the Taj Mahal, not just the cliched view of it, this front-on view, but to show it in its landscape setting. And that's the plan he does to show all of the different elements. The J at the bottom right there is the Taj itself. I is the site of the black marble tomb of Shah Jahan. And you can see these other elements down the river, which are all part of its landscape setting. No one else has really done this. The stupa of Borobudur in Java, for example, he relates this as a landscape experience primarily. And I won't go into the detail of this, but explains the meaning behind these terraces. And the finale. And in ancient China, if you look at this image, you can see the floating sage, the little man floating in the sky on the left there, dreaming of immortality in a thatched cottage, a late 16th century painting. And this is the sage is also in his little thatched cottage there on the right. It's the same man. It's sort of floating. It's as if his mind has taken wing, if you like. And Jellicoe relates these sorts of ideas of you see how the branch of the tree is overhanging the eaves of the cottage there. And he believes that the character for tree used on bronze castings became a diagram for a park. And the building technique came from this. The structures were being framed, not as in Europe with a rigid triangular truss on load-bearing walls, but with a complete frame system stabilized by a heavy roof of clay tiles. And then he gives practical examples of this in action. And then wonderful places like Egypt, he talks about the pyramids, shows us a diagram to show how they're all related asymmetrically to one another, but precisely orientated to the cardinal points. And all around them, the tombs of the nobility. And then shows the River Nile, which he says formed a continuous metaphysical linear landscape. So this is a big picture thinking. Jellicoe is a visionary teacher and an example, I think, to us all, going beyond problem solving, taking us to some quite strange places, not really worrying about these rather already dated notions like future proofing and so on, but being earnestly artistic and psychological in his approach, but also historical, really believing that it's very important for all designers to think historically above all. And that's certainly my experience as a critic. I'll stop sharing my screen now. My experience as a landscape critic over the years is that the really, really good people are always the people, always have an interest in landscape history. They don't have to get it right. Quite often the landscape designers I've met who are really good their history isn't very accurate, but it doesn't really matter very much. The main thing is that they have been engaged with it and have thought about it, and invariably it gives them a much deeper, more profound, interesting, and actually perhaps paradoxically original take on what it is that they're doing. There we are. Thank you. Hand back to you now, Alessandro.
Thank you very much. Mr. Leroux, Darcy, is like you want to give us a few words as a sponsor of IFLA?
Sure. I have a quick presentation too, if I may, and talk about it.
Of course.
If you folks can see this okay. Everyone see my screen okay? Perfect. So I appreciate the opportunity of being here today. It's amazing to be here with these sort of distinguished individuals who are talking about landscape architecture education. I come at this a little bit differently as coming from industry. So I'm here representing Crystal Fountains. We're a water feature design and manufacturing company, which is a third generation company founded by my grandfather, Roger, actually, in 1966. But I'm here because I'm passionate about landscape architecture, because it's been my entire life. Water features as part of landscape design, and we're only here because of the work of landscape architects. So for 60 years, we've been working at this intersection of art, engineering, landscape, and technology. So when I think about the evolving sort of education for landscape architects, having worked with landscape architects, we have landscape architects who work at our firm through my sort of 20-year history in this industry. I see the changing tides and ways of education being done in the sort of the new people that I meet in the industry. So we've seen the industry move from hand sketches to complex sort of digital models. But all of this doesn't change our mission. Our mission has always been this idea of we want to be working to craft joy with water and light, is a water feature within landscape for sort of human enjoyment of different spaces. So as we discuss kind of landscapes in motion, the kind of theme of today, I want to reflect on this gap that continues to exist between a pretty render of a site and an actual functioning site. I come from a much more sort of practical within industry kind of viewpoint. So too often we see students who are taught to design water as a landscape element as a static blue shape on a map or a set of plans. But in reality, water is a living system. We don't teach technical literacy enough, I find, understanding budgets, safety codes, and mechanical guts. We risk projects that look great on screen, but fail to match their intent in the real world. So to navigate these complexities and move beyond the limitations of a digital-only approach as the world evolves this way, we have a refined methodology centered on sort of three main pillars: vernacular wisdom, physical experimentation, and direct site presence. These aren't just stages in a checklist. There are reality checks that ensure a design remains technically sound, culturally relevant, and designed to last. By grounding our process in these areas, we bridge the gap between sort of the initial design and a successful high-performing outcome that truly serves the human experience. So the first, vernacular wisdom. We believe technology is at its best when it acts as a bridge to a site's history. So in the context of landscape architecture and design, vernacular wisdom refers to accumulated knowledge, traditions, and building practices, but developed by local communities. So when we think about the Palace of Versailles, for instance, where we've been working for the last 10 years, we weren't just thinking about installing lighting. The actual vision for this space was, how do we match the aesthetic that Louis XIV had in his gardens while having guests visit? So we want to teach the local story of the space before we get into a project to make sure that it's specific to its culture and geography. So on this project specifically, the lighting desire that was developed was specifically to show what the fountains would look like if they were illuminated by candlelight, because that's how the actual water features were initially illuminated. The second step is physical experimentation. Water is unpredictable, and physical experimentation is our most important classroom, especially on never-before-seen effects or applications, which we often get involved in. We use our testing facilities in Toronto to prove what a computer can only guess. Currently, no digital prototype can replace the look, touch, and sound of water and lighting in a mock-up, which is definitely something we see quite often in designs, is this idea of like what looks good on paper or on a screen. And water is such a truthful, honest element. It's very hard to show exactly how to depict and the emotions it can create when just looking solely at a screen. So for the Crown Fountain in Chicago, for instance, we had to build a full-scale mock-up to ensure the overflowing runnel effects would work against real-world wind and safe water velocities for interactive play. By bringing the workshop back into education, we work to teach students that a successful landscape is a proven process, not just a drawing. So all of our employees, we've worked with local universities and colleges to bring people in for mock-ups and different experiments to see these sort of elements working in real time. And the third would be direct site presence, something that I'm a big proponent of. We have to get back to site. You cannot feel a landscape on a Zoom call. You need to hear the sounds, experience the wayfinding, feel the pulse, and be inspired by the space where you're working. So this is the experience that we had at Longwood Gardens in the United States. So we walked the gardens, experienced the wayfinding, seen how people engage with the space, with the water show that's been sort of very closely associated with Longwood Gardens as it was evolved back in 2016. This was a project designed by Fluidity Design Consultants in Los Angeles, but our team spent weeks on site calibrating lighting to match the historical tones and experiences of the garden. This to us is where we believe stewardship really begins. So when we think about rethinking education, technology and more focus on technology and design disciplines is a wonderful partner, but it isn't a replacement for our senses. By grounding education in local history, physical testing, and real time on site, we ensure that public spaces remain resilient, safe, and deeply human. Let's teach the next generation to do the same, is our belief. So when I hear the other speakers here talking today, I think there's much more that we in industry can do to embrace and actual education in universities, in colleges, and how do we tie sort of that education to some of the practicality that we see on the day to day. So I appreciate the time.
Thank you very much. We don't have that much time left, so we'll put a simple question, but I think trying to cover something that we did not address, although it is related to education, and we had several perspectives, as it was already pointed out. Rosalia, Ed, and Mr. Richardson, we've been talking about landscape architecture. We've been talking about the growth of landscape architecture, how it is like probably acknowledged, which is very important today and in the future. I've been pointing out about the number of education programs. At the same time, also, in any case, we know very well that landscape architecture education institutions currently are very challenging. So there is some kind of conflict in between the profession, which is growing, and then is a knowledge that is becoming more and more important, in education institutions which instead are closing, facing difficulties. So can you a little bit elaborate on that and provide your perspective on the topic, starting from you, Rosalia?
I think it's a super interesting issue and sort of a complex problem. And I guess from my observation, from a privileged position of a program that's very old in an American context, but within the American context, I've noticed that a number of institutions are under pressure, and there has been a history of this happening over time. But one would say it's actually how education is being valued, how it's being sort of framed and from a university perspective, rather than necessarily a program perspective. So I think education, the institute, the sort of way that the institution was framed was very different from many years ago, whereas there's a high sort of conversation about sort of the economics of programs, the sort of viability of programs. The language has changed. So, and one could argue that it's the political mindset, the way that education is part of an economy, a sort of a growing economy or an economic model that maybe wasn't so heavily sort of integrated in previously. But I'll hand it, just knowing time, I'll let the others sort of also contribute to that conversation.
Head.
Thanks, Alessandro. I'd agree with Rose's response. I think that we have in many parts of the world a political climate where education is valued differently than it was before. I think that there's market economics that are coming into play as well, that as universities compete for students, to use university language, there is a greater emphasis on larger disciplines that can attract larger numbers of students. And we know that landscape architecture is a smaller discipline, smaller field of work. And I think this is a challenge. Certainly within a UK context, which I work within mostly, we have seen not just landscape architecture as a field under pressure in universities, but I think it extends across the arts, design, humanities disciplines. And I think that the political climate nationally, as well as sort of a different economic approach to education, makes it a significant challenge. I think that there's ways to I believe there's ways to address these challenges, but they need to happen at multiple levels, from the levels of our national accreditation bodies to regionally universities, but also I think the industry in general. Yeah, I think it's a challenge, but I think it's also it's not felt consistently in universities. So I think that this is also one of the things that is quite difficult is universities are also they're pushed to compete against each other, which doesn't give such a collective and collegial approach to addressing a challenge like this.
Mr. Richardson, what is your take on this sociocultural milieu? Because finally, what we are trying to address, what Ed and Rosalia were discussing or presenting was about a sociocultural condition of these days.
Yeah, thank you. You can call me Tim, by the way. We've nearly finished now, but thank you. Uh, um, Well, I mean, I suppose from my perspective, I'm looking at the landscape architecture profession itself and what has happened to it in the last 20, 30 years. Geoffrey Jellicoe would have been delighted to have seen what has happened. In the landscape architecture profession, it seems to me, has rocketed up in the hierarchy of the design disciplines. And as you know, many architecture companies and so on are looking to landscape architecture firms to work hand in partnership without necessarily being the sort of superior partner, if you like. And also, landscape architecture has, after a slow start, managed to change gear in response to the challenges of climate change, which have really obviously been very aware of since the 80s and into the 90s. But really, it was only in the early decades, first 2 decades of the 2000s that the landscape architecture did actually successfully grab that agenda back and kind of own it. It wasn't really in a very good place to do it before then, it seems to me, because a lot of landscape architecture firms were really not very well up on sustainability issues. So the profession as a whole is capable of changing. And what I would say is that the profession as a whole ought to widen its parameters. The profession should take in urban design, urban planning, and so on. There have been attempts to do this already. The doctrines of landscape urbanism, for example, have been an attempt to do this. But I think in a way that the landscape architecture profession needs to own a larger piece of the turf or the territory, which is occupied by design disciplines, and be a little bit more confident in itself. And spread itself a little bit wider, certainly not thinner, but wider. And then I think it will have a people of this sort of mindset, if you like, a horizontal mindset rather than the vertical one, will have a greater influence in the future.
I don't know if Rosalia had a team at this point. Have questions for each other, something you want to point out in each other statements and replies. Is there anything you want to add? We are close to the end, so if there is something you want to point out, that's the moment.
Rose, do you want to go first, or Tim?
Well, yes, I mean, thank you. I enjoyed both presentations a great deal. I mean, uh, Rosalie, I that was quite an elaborate sort of system in a way you proposed there with this planetary student and all these different students and the wonderful drawings and so on. But what I did really like about it was the way that the emphasis was being placed back onto the individual student and what their needs are and what their expectations of education are. And obviously, that's partly, I suppose, to do with the way that education funding has changed. And to some extent, those who are the educators have to sort of be aware that they are providing a service which is being paid for by individuals. So there's more of an emphasis on that, on what the customer, if you like, is receiving. But I thought it was really interesting to see these different categories of students expand. It was almost like a sort of astrological chart or something with the different sort of characteristics that people had. And I'm sure this is a very good idea because students will then have a sense of intellectual care. I'm not talking about pastoral care, but sort of intellectual care and cultural care, which those who are educating them um, are, are expressing towards them in this way, which is also a form of respect towards the students as well. So I thought that was a very interesting and worthwhile way of beginning to think about the relationship.
Maybe back at you, Tim, like I guess many of these students, and also Ed, many of these students were not necessarily just identified in the classroom, but actually identified through history, that we have sort of linkages to sort of different types of education models, different understandings of the way that we would work within the landscape. But then sort of we've seen that sort of student change over time as well, and there's new emerging sort of students that sort of appear. But maybe for both of you, like, you know, one is like, do we see in Jellicoe's work sort of a variation of potentially the way that the student may have been identified, or, you know, how we might sort of, what needs to change in terms of, you know, the institution, like if you were to change something in the institution, what would it be?
That's a big question, Rose. Um, I mean, just to add, and where Alexandra, we're coming to a close, but I think I reflect. I think Stephen Buckle has added in the comments. Stephen's at Aspect Studios. Sort of the appreciating Tim's confident voice about landscape architecture, and I think that's really important to remember, because there are moments of sort of pessimism and even navel gazing in landscape architecture. And I think we have to remember there's some extraordinary work and an amazing development of the industry. And I think also we need to remember that universities are not the only places for education and for learning. And I think it's beholden to us as educators, those committed to higher education. I think for me, committed to higher education and sort of, in public universities, it's on us to think about how our work can empower young people to do the work of landscape architecture and to continue to transform it positively. And I think that's, like I said earlier, I think it's absolutely within our within possibilities to make that change. But I think it takes work, and I think that's maybe the aim of the working group, of the work that IFLA is doing, and many others.
Thank you. Anushruti, Melanie, are there any questions that you receive? Is there any communication that you want to give at the end of this webinar?
No, I think we don't have any questions, but I really want to thank all the panelists. I think, this was a really, really great discussion. And yes, I think let's just continue these discussions forward. If, from the audience, if any one of you want to get in touch with, me for anything, my email address I'll mention in the chat box. But yeah, just want to thank everyone for being a part of this.
For everyone connected, Anushruti is our communication manager. There's another person that you don't see, is Melanie, is our corporate manager. So thank you for everyone. Have a nice day, afternoon, evening, and then to the next webinar by IFLA. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks, Alex.
Bye.